بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله المبعوث رحمة للعالمين. So let's regroup, inshallah, with the ladder of guidance. Last time, before we broke for Ramadan, we were dealing with, we were still dealing with the section on Sajda Sahw. In the ladder of guidance, uh, what precedes Sajda Sahw is a conversation on what invalidates the Salah, on what invalidates the Salah. And then he goes into Sajda Sahw. And what we were doing is that we were taking Sajda Sahw directly from an Akhdari. Now, one of the challenges that has presented itself is without the actual physical text, most of the translations that are online have issues, either in terms of the language, uh, not necessarily that the English is unclear, but at times there is a discrepancy in the use of the singular and the plural, and then they're attempting to uh, translate a poem so it doesn't vibe 100%, or the translation is off on some issues, unfortunately. That's why it's beneficial to have the Arabic and the English together. So I didn't want to completely read uh, without a visual from the translation of Aisha Bluli. The benefit of her translation from Mukhtasar al-Akhdari, which is published by Diwan Press, is that it has the Arabic and the English parallel. So if there is an issue with the English, it can be corrected uh, by referring to the Arabic. Now, even in the ladder of guidance, there is a separation between the Arabic text and English, but there is an Arabic text that is available. In the case that something in the language in the English translation is not clear, or if it becomes too dense. So, in review, because it's been some time since we've dealt with this topic, the idea of sajda sahu, it is that we have a means to repair the salah in the event or in the case when something substantial is deficient. And what we mean by something that is substantial is something that qualifies as needing to be addressed, an action that has to be addressed. There's some actions in the salah that if they go unperformed, whether intentionally or otherwise, the salah remains to be intact, and it is formally sound. It is formally sound. Uh, if certain actions are left off, that they're recognized as being those acts which can be left off. And then there are other actions, and these come with levels, right? The obligations and the established sunan. These types of actions, uh, established sunan means those practices of the sunnah that have been practiced with frequency and continuity within the context of the salah by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and there's no indication uh, that he left them off, and there's no indication that there's permissibility to leave them off. The indication here would be to survey or to look over or to review the acts of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in his practice of the salah, and see if there are times in which certain things are they go unperformed and the salah appears to be intact. So we take our practice of the salah from an understanding of the sunnah from the modeling of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, from a modeling of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And there is no doubt that at times the differences that you find among the scholars when it comes to the salah and eventually the schools of practice. I don't want to say the madhab, but schools of practice. At the core, the salah is the same. Everyone is beginning with the takbir. Everyone is standing. Everyone is going into ruku' or they're going into the bowing position. They're going into sujud, which is the prostration. They're sitting back and resting for some period of time, whether short or equal to the other movements. They're going back into that, and that is what constitutes what we call a rak'ah, or some translate it as a unit. And so for Fajr Salah or for Subh Salah, it is, as we say in the Maliki Madhab, the Subh Salah, it is the established morning prayer. Fajr is called the Sunan. That's contrary to the other madhab. But in any event, the salah that is an obligation in the morning is 2 rakat. The salah that is an obligation at the time of the midday is 4 rakat. At the time of the waning of the sun, uh, also the time is 4 rakat. The time of the initial evening, which is Maghrib, is 3 rakat, and the evening prayer, as it's understood as Isha, is 4 rak'ah. And so in that, there's no difference. The salah begins with the takbir and it ends with the salam. The other things that come into the salah, as far as classifying a particular action or uh, certain concepts that come up that are mentioned in the books of fiqh, there are some rooms for differing on some things. But those differences don't amount to the salah being unrecognizable as salah, to the point where each school has their own act of worship to the extent that it's not recognizable by the average person as salah. Right. And so that's something that has to be really clear to us, because the person not grounded in knowledge and not having a detailed understanding on issues, especially the knowledge of how and why the scholars differ. They automatically assume that everything is differences of opinion and it's a matter of chaos and there's no common ground, there's no stable practice. That's the extreme. Others, they just see confusion, they can make sense of certain things. There's different mindsets that come about when we start talking about the differences of the ulama. But for the student should be clear why there are some differences, right? The category of the student is not like the category of the person that does not study. And there are levels to the students in terms of their understanding. And so the student should be clear that the base structure or frame of the salah is the same. It is the same. The differences come on some of the points of classification and how it is that you see some of the details. And part of that, it comes because the Sahaba radiallahu anhum ajma'in, They traveled to different places and they took their knowledge with them. And so part of the reality of the Sunnah is that the whole of the Sunnah is never captured by only one companion. And so the whole of the Sunnah is grasped or captured when we look at all of the companions. And of course, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam as being the foundation. So the Sahaba radiallahu anhum ajmeen, they go to different parts of the world, especially in the time of Uthman radiallahu anhu, and they build up educational centers around themselves because in the time of Umar, they were designated to go, they were appointed to go to different regions to teach. And so they take whatever knowledge it is that they have and they build up those communities with that knowledge. Now, after some time, the hadith are codified, and there's a whole discussion around that. They're collected and codified. Codified means that the hadith that are written are organized and filtered and so on and so forth. Writing was taking place since the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But the codification process is not a simple process. So what that does is that it brings a discussion on how do we grade the ahadith? How do we grade them, and what do we consider to be a proof that obligates action, and what do we consider other than that? Right. And so with the codification of hadith, which began roughly with Malik, and then it reached a higher point in the time of Shafi'i and in the time period of Imam Ahmed. They both were contemporaries to each other. And it continued with the Imams and Hadith that are known, like Bukhari and others thereafter. What that did is that it forced now people to reevaluate because they may have considered a Hadith not to be reliable, but it was reliable, or they may have considered a Hadith to be actionable, to be practiced, but then realized the Hadith was abrogated or was not actionable anymore. They considered that there were some hadith that they may not have known, and so on and so forth. And so the Ummah has never considered this to be a real issue because this remained in the realm of scholars. It only becomes an issue when people begin to fall out of the etiquette of the way of knowledge and fall into the realm and in the practice and in the ethics of sectarianism. At that point in time, then the diversity that exists in knowledge becomes a reason for differing to the point where it is uh, where it becomes problematic. It becomes problematic and creates confusion amongst the masses. So not all scholars are on the same level in that seriality, and some contribute to misunderstanding because what they communicate is a certain level of knowledge in a certain way with a certain etiquette. And the issue of tolerance, not only tolerance from the angle of being open, because this is not a matter of just being open to anything, but also being understanding. That's why, for instance, people like Ibn Rushd in Bidayat al-Mujtahid, he gives us a framework on how to deal with differences. So in the Maliki school, as mentioned before, it has its unique qualities. But when it comes to this section of fiqh, when it comes to this gateway of knowledge, or this unit of knowledge, the sajda sahw, or the prostration of forgetfulness, is the most developed from all of the four schools, and that have been transmitted to us. Right, the possibly what comes second in rank is, or close to, the Maliki school. Thereafter is the school of Ahmed in terms of similarity. And part of the reason why you have this detail in the Maliki school is the accounting for the varying practices of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So part of that accounting, or coming to consider why it is that the Prophet did certain things, is this system of those acts that come before the salam and those acts that come after the salam. And this issue allows us, this organization, I should say, it allows us to be able to make sense of the ahadith that we find that may at face value to appear contradictory. Right. So in the Sulam al-Huda, in the ladder of guidance, which is the text before us, in the seventh chapter, here Sidi Muhammad Sharif translated this as on the circumstances of the prostration and forgetfulness before the salam. Right. And we begin to look at this as one section of knowledge, right? That there are certain circumstances which obligate us to perform uh, the sajda sahw before the salam, right? And then there are others which obligate us to perform it after the salam. And when I say obligate here, I'm just meaning that uh, that's how it's done. Because even when it comes to the whole discussion on sajda sahw, whether it is obligatory or not, we've talked about this in past sessions, that the ulama, they have some discussion about this with some of them, and I incline in that direction, saying that the prostration before the salam is an obligation, and the prostration after the salam is a sunnah. And this becomes an interesting discussion because when we look at what is said about such a sahw, like here, prostration for forgetfulness in the prayer is a sunnah. So that's what Imam al-Akhdari has said. But then when you go deeper, you begin to see that the language is not so clear, right? And that is part of what caused us to attempt to work through this material for such time. When you go deeper into the books of fiqh, you indeed find that within the madhab, there's some differences of opinion with this regard. But that language, we can either consider the idea of sunnah to be the practice of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the general sense, and then we're free and clear from the problem of whether it's an obligation or not an obligation, because we know that the term sunnah has a number of different meanings to it, right? The term sunnah has a number of meanings to it. So here it says that the prostration for forgetfulness in the prayers is sunnah, right? That's with regard to the hukum or with regard to the ruling, that type of thing. With in that regard, it becomes confusing because then the question is, in other cases that come up with the salah, the sajda sahu, it appears that you can leave it off. In other cases, it says that the salah is invalid if it's not performed. And we tried to deal with this question earlier on, but one way that we can backtrack and say to kind of get, and this is kind of my own interpretation, so to speak. So I'm not going to say this is necessarily there in the madhab as a whole, but the practice of sajda sahw, it is a prophetic practice. We can say that, right? And there's no issue, there's no concern in that type of statement as it being problematic, part of the knowledge of the deen, or not having a basis. No, in actuality, we know it is an established practice of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that he performed sajda sahw as a way to correct the salah. It's something there's no doubt in it. Now the question is, are there occasions in which sajda sahw is recommended? Are there occasions in which sajda sahw, or highly recommended, we should say, or emphasized? And, and are there occasions in which sajda sahw is an obligation? Are there occasions in which if sajda sahw is omitted, that it can be forgiven? Yes. You have a number of different scenarios that come along with that. And that is part of the benefit of studying fiqh in this way, that the scholars specifically of the madhahib across the board, when they were dealing with Quran and the Sunnah, now I'm talking about their thinking. They focus on scenario thinking. They focus on scenario thinking. And part of the scenario thinking, what I mean by that is that they gave examples for why it is, for what it is that needs to be done. So in this case, you do XYZ. In that case, you do XYZ. And those scenarios became the models by which people uh, began to learn different elements, in this case of Salah, right? So you you find it's not only in Salah, they do it in other cases, but that type of thinking is what you find within the madhab orientation. That there's a lot of scenarios. Now, if you take Imam Shawkani, rahmatullahi alayhi, Imam Shawkani, you're not going to find, for instance, in Dur al-Bahiyya, which is one of his basic foundational books, you're not going to find a lot of definitions. You're not going to find a lot of scenarios, because in his orientation, he's focused on what is the basis, what is the evidence of the practice. He's not focused on explicating and clarifying and detailing. And as we mentioned many uh, moons ago at this point, Shah Wali Allah rahmatullahi alayhi, in the Insaf, the book Al Insaf, he noted that a lot of this detailing and the classifying and the ordering and organizing of ideas, of definitions, of proofs, and all of that, that was not done in the time of the Sahaba with a lot of commitment and seriousness as we see it is done in the time period of the later day scholars, right? A good student of knowledge is going to understand that there's also a culture of knowledge, right? There's a culture of knowledge, and there are varying reasons that serve as the impetus or the force behind why something is done. And so each stage of knowledge within the history of the ummah, we have to understand what's going on there. You know what I'm saying? What are the motivating factors for why this is being done? In the time period of the Sahaba, there was not a lot of necessity to go into details because in many cases, which the later day scholars tried or attempted to preserve. The first thing is that in the time period of the Sahaba, they had the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the Prophet modeled, in the case of the Salah, modeled the Salah. So they were interacting with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The other thing is that revelation was coming down. So revelation was being revealed gradually, step by step. So the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, they acquired knowledge gradually, not all at one time. They were not overwhelmed with a flood of knowledge, so to speak, that had typhoon types of effects. It's just so weighty, so overwhelming that it knocks you out. Of course, the knowledge of revelation is weighty, right? But along with it being weighty, there's a facility that was there. And part of that facility, which distinguishes this ummah from other ummah, is the issue of graduality. Things came step by step. So the Sahaba, they had a first encounter with the knowledge and they saw it implemented. And there was no issue of fabrication of a hadith. There was no issue of having to deal with 20 years of hadith, 23 years of hadith knowledge, like the later day people have to deal with, right? The later day people have to deal with being distant from the actual practice of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Prophet was no longer in their midst. It was the people who embodied the Sunnah. It was not only the people who embodied the Sunnah, but it was the companions, which now had to model that knowledge. And as we said, the companions were at different levels of knowledge. Companions don't stand equal to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? And so the companions, they modeled that knowledge, and so that causes for there to be a necessity to investigate and pause on certain things and regroup. And regroup to make sure that we're understanding correctly. To make sure sometimes the companion will hear something and miss something, right? And so that's why the efforts of the scholars becomes important, right? Does that mean that we lost in the knowledge of the deen? No, no. Doesn't mean that we lost in the knowledge of the deen. But what it does mean is that Islam obligates learning, you know what I'm saying, and understanding, and the community took that serious. And so these types of issues are not issues in the community of knowledge. They don't raise serious doubts. They don't shake people's foundations. They don't cause people to have a dilemma in their deen. These issues, like dilemmas in shaky foundations, come from a people that is distant from being connected to the way of knowledge, right? And that's kind of what has happened. That's what has happened with time is that the community has become so distant on like this age that we're in is the age we're in. The majority of the ummah has no knowledge of the Arabic language. We've never seen that. In today's time, people will argue and fight for not having to put in any work to understand the Quran, right? And sorry to say, but they will travel the world or they will go into debt to get a degree in a certain area. But then when it comes to the deen, that level of commitment won't be there. That doesn't mean that people are deficient or bad because they don't put in the effort to maybe like learn Arabic as an example. It's just a different time period that we're living in that regard. And so when you have a vast majority of people that are distant from the language, what it does is it blocks them from having access, direct access to the sources, and then they will learn how to work with the sources through education. So we have to work in the language of the people. So then that facilitation process then it becomes like, well, are the people willing to learn even at that level? So the knowledge culture is important because it keeps us in the ring. So things that we encounter and study, we work through them. But when you're not part of the knowledge circle, knowledge culture, it creates confusion, right? And I said all of that to explain this point, how it is that Al Akhdari, he talks about the prostrating for forgetfulness in the prayer is a sunnah. And then when he begins to detail things out, you find that, hold on a second, there are occasions where it's an obligation. So, how do we know it's an obligation? We know it's an obligation because the salah isn't valid with its non-performance. Then with forgetting the prostration forgetfulness in certain situations, the salah is invalid. So if the salah is invalid, it's impossible for the forgetting of something that is a non-obligation to invalidate the salah. So that would mean that if we forgot something, it was necessary to do in order for the salah to be valid, right? And so then we have to make sense of the language and why it is that we have various positions and why it is that we have multiple understandings. That's what I tried to clarify and talking about the history of fiqh and talking about the history of hadith and talking about the special role of the Sahaba and all of those subjects have way more details. Here he says, when two elements are left out of the prayer, one should make two prostrations before the salam after the completion of the tashahhud. And one should add another tashahhud after them. This is in order that the salam comes after the tashahhud. So the nice thing here that's being said here, this here is what we call, like when it says this, uh, here where it says this is in order. Okay, so what this is doing here, what's happening here, is you're getting a reason, a rationale. Okay, so here you're being told when two elements are left out of the prayer, and the elements here are two sunan. How do we know that? We know that because not only from our previous studies, but because here the prostration is before the salam, right? It's before the salam. And he says, Sheikh Umar, he says, uh, when two elements are left out of the prayer, one should make two prostrations before the salam, after the completion of the tashahhud, right? And one should add another tashahhud after them. So then the question comes, why are we adding another tashahhud? Right? Because in the other madhahib, that doesn't come up. This is in order that the salam comes after the tashahhud, so that the organization of the actions of the salah, they follow a chronological order. I'm giving this as an example here. So there's a logic, so to speak. There's a logic. Action, this action one, action two, action three, action four. So we're able to account for those things. And then we're able to say this as a whole is complete, right? But the the fact that standing comes before the bowing, and it comes before the prostration, and it comes before the tashahhud, and it comes before the salam. That's the idea of what comes before what comes after what. The order, the tartib, they call it in Arabic tartib. So the reason why the tashahhud, we do it again, is so that the tashahhud falls in its proper order. So with that said, that's one of the benefits of madhab based fiqh. There's more than one way to skin a cat, so to speak. There's more than one way to do fiqh. Okay, the madhab are not the only way. The way that we understand the madhab as we understand them. I mentioned people like Shawkani. There's other people, the scholars of hadith, they have their way and they have their logic and so on and so forth. That, whether we like it or not, is part of knowledge. It's an approach to knowledge. It exists. It existed before us. It existed before the concept of the four madhabs. It exists. But one of the benefits of this approach is that we pause and we reflect on how we organize our knowledge. Now, sometimes, and this is the criticism towards the madhab based fiqh, sometimes that pausing and that reflection is so extended out that it seems to be removed from the simplicity of a straightforward approach that you kind of get when you're more closer to the hadith text. But in defense of this orientation, a lot of times also embedded in these reflections, although it may not be apparent, it is the integration of various ahadith that seem to contradict one another, right? And so when you, in the case of when you have the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam continuously perform salah according to an order, and that order is not broken, then regard for that order becomes a matter of importance. And so some understandings we get from Majmu' al-Adillah. And what that means is that some understandings we get when we take all of the evidences into consideration. We take the Quran into consideration, we take the Ahadith into consideration. Sometimes in the school of Malik, when those things are not 100% clear, or in some cases, the practice of the people of Medina, because the Medina was the place of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, comes in also as part of the discussion on how do we do certain things, right? But in any event, if you look at individual evidences, you may not find something specific. But if you look at all of the evidences together, then you may find the support for something. Right. So those are might not make sense now, but I'm laying down the groundwork for how we deal with evidences. So we just don't deal with evidences one hadith at a time, because there may be another hadith that may be the opposition to that. Like in Sunan al-Nisa'i, Imam al-Nisa'i, rahmatullahi alayhi, in his hadith collection, that's one of the things that distinguishes Imam al-Nisa'i from the other Imams. Because each Imam from the major collections of a hadith, they have their own logic that governs their hadith collection. They're not all following the same approach. And there's reasons for that. Right. So they all bring something different to the table. So Sunan and Nasai, when he deals with hadith, he's collecting a hadith that in which you're seeing the Prophet do this and do the opposite. Alayhi salatu wasalam. And they're both Sahih hadith. So his collection is devoted to that. So in any event, when you go back to the issue of methodology, you can't just take one hadith at a time. That's why some brothers, in the context of the Salafi da'wah, they will put out a hadith and not be clear that there's another hadith. Because the only way that you can be, and this has been brought up, sometimes it's been brought up as a negative in terms of as a criticism, right? But the only time that you can really, like you in order for you to know, like there's tons of a hadith. So if you're obligating the average person to know a hadith for everything without a system of study, that's where the confusion comes in. That's where a lot of criticism was waged at the Salafi dawah. The Salafi minhaj or methodology is not that. The hadith approach is not that. The scholarly approach is not that. Because the scholarly approach knows that you have to start somewhere, and the scholarly approach knows that you're not going to be able to grasp all of the knowledge. You have to have some sort of system. And that's where people got confused the issue of the madhab and the issue of hadith because although it was a good concept to push people forward so that they become more and more literate of hadith, the approach was erroneous, right? The approach was erroneous. Uh, it was erroneous because it was putting the burden on the average person that is the burden of the highest level of scholarship. And the highest level of scholarship is that you have the ability to access the Quran and the Sunnah, that it at least, I'm not even saying memorization, but that it's at your fingertips and you're able to research it and you're able to go through that whole process to make sure that one hadith doesn't contradict another hadith and so on and so forth. So these types of things, we may not have a clear hadith, but we're able to look at the whole of the practice of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in this case of the salah. So the organization, the fact that the salam comes after the tashahhud, is something that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam did not deviate from. Now the scholars may debate if I leave off the salam, but I stood there for the period of the tashahhud, is my salah valid or invalid? And sure, that discussion comes up. So the Hanafis have that type of discussion, and they have their system. They have their way of classifying their proofs. We don't have to agree with it, but everything that they say, they have to prove it. And that's where some people have misunderstood the madhab. The fact that you have diversity is the fact that this school may not agree with that school. But that doesn't mean they tear down that school. They may disagree with a particular set of actions. I don't agree with that. I'm not practicing that way. I have my evidences. And that's where, we learn the culture of tolerance. So here, whoever leaves out an element and adds an element should make the prostration before the salam. So what has more weight here? What has more weight here in the case of addition and in the case of subtraction? Not gonna work. What has more weight between the two is that if I were to leave out something and add it, which one has more weight? In this case, what I mean by more weight is that which one is going to determine when I make the prostration. Leaving out is going to determine when I make the prostration in this case. That's why it's before the salam, because the deficiency has to be accounted for. See, and so here in the Madhab of Malik, you have the issue of adding something to the salah, subtracting something from the salah. Then you have the issue of subtracting something from the salah and adding something to the salah. In either event, you only have two prostrations. That's before the salam, before the salam, and after the salam. But you have two prostrations that come before the salam. One, if you are deficient in something. Two, if you are deficient in something and you also add. So that situation or that scenario, or those two scenarios, we should say, they necessitate that the salam be that the prostration be before the salam. We're not going to get into the issue after the salam because, but mostly after what comes after the salam is when you add something. That's the reality. When you add something. So let's stop there, inshallah. So I have to go in if there's any I'm sorry to cut it short today, but if there's any questions or anything, just send it in the group, inshallah. In this book, everyone should have this already, right? Everyone should have this, and the video, I should put out the video so that it can be there with you as well. The most important thing to grasp here is this concept of prostrating for forgetfulness in the salah is the sunnah. How can we make sense of this idea that it's sunnah, but then at times we're saying that the salah is invalid within the scenarios that we're given? We're not just bringing that as a criticism. This is internal in the madhab. There's a debate and a discussion on this issue. That's important. The other issue that comes in is prostrating before the salam. Why is there prostrating before the salam? Prostrating, prostrating before the salam, prostrating after the salam. I gave the three scenarios, right? We said the prostration comes before the salam and after the salam, and we said that in the case of prostration before the salam, there's two reasons. One, because there's a deficiency that's made. The second, because there's a deficiency in an addition that is made. And we said the reason why, in this case, where there's a deficiency in addition, that we prostrate before the salam, is that the deficiency is stronger than the addition, right? So it's pulling us into that category of making the prostration before the salam. Why do we make a second tashahhud unlike the other madhahib? Why do we make this two tashahhuds? So for instance, it says when two elements are left out of the prayer, one should make two prostrations, right? Before the salam, after the completion of the tashahhud, right? And then one, but there's no salam, right? This is all before the salam. And then one should add another tashahhud after you make the prostration. Why do we do that? In order that the salam comes after the tashahhud to preserve the order of the salah. The order of things, especially you see that especially in wudu, is very important in the Maliki school, right? The order of how things is done. You find some flexibility, especially in the issue wudu, within the Hanafi school. But within the school of Malik, the order is important. And people, that's also how the deen is preserved. You see what I'm saying? Because there's this attempt to keep things the way that they were practiced. Right. That doesn't mean that there's no flexibility and so on and so forth, but that's one way of doing things, right? That's one way of doing things. In the logic of the Hanafis look to the reasons why things are done. Say, oh, we can flip this around on these. in this way or that way, but we know the reasons why these things are done. So they have their logic, right, to it. But there is a prophetic model, and so in this case, the idea of the order is important. So those are the things that I want you to be left with, and the whole concept of why do we find that the Malikis extend out this chapter? This is a vast chapter, and you're not going to find outside of the Akhdari, even in the bigger books, a very vast discussion on this. Akhdari expands this out, in the madhab. And then everyone kind of details their discussion around al Akhdari, whether they agree or disagree. But again, we said that within the madhab, there's a consideration for how do you deal with the varying proofs and how do you reconcile between them. And we said that the the school of Ahmed comes close. The school of Imam Ahmed comes close to the Maliki school. So I'll send out the video, inshallah. And until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam.